Okay, so today we'll be going over the IEB 2022 IT past paper. We'll just be covering the OOP section as this is the most important one. I mean, it's 100 marks as compared to 50 of SQL. So it's doubly as important. And SQL is generally not a problem with most students, whereas OOP seems to be where most people struggle. Okay, so we're given this whole scenario here, a bunch of paragraphs, a whole lot of sentences, words. If you're taking IT, I assume you're not a fan of words. You're a more practical person. So how I usually advise approaching these papers is don't read this section. It does nothing for you, especially when you're starting. It just serves to confuse you. Like, what the heck is an unsigned or 75% test results or what's going on? I'm just seeing a lot of words. I'm confused. What I advise doing rather is just scrolling all the way to question 2 and get started. Because as you'll see, we're given a class diagram and literally question 2 and 3 in this case is just having to implement this class diagram. Nothing special. You don't need any of this information up here. Hence, we'll just get started with that. Question 2. So jumping to the code, I've already created my package here. I mean my project folder and my package. In here, I'll create a new class, and questions 2 said call it crew member. So that's what we'll do. Crew member. I'll close that and zoom in just so you can see a little bit better. Okay. So question 2, just to read it properly, use a class diagram below to create a class called crew member. The class will be used to create objects to store the details of a crew member. The diagram indicates the required fields and methods. Okay. So here we see a private string full name, private int, private string again, and public static. Remember that underline there means static. Public static integer, and then the basic methods, constructor, full name, and whatnot. Okay. So with that being said, let's get started. So I think that's a bit too zoomed in, but better. So for private string called full name, private int, I think what's called crew ID, and then private string again, so it's department, and a public static int num promoted crew equals 0. Let's just double check. String full name int crew ID, string department num promoted crew. Perfect. And that's what these questions say, hence I didn't read over them. I'm just literally going over this. Now it says make the constructor, so that's what we'll do. Public crew member, and it's string in fn, oops, int cid, string dp. Oh, let's check in dt. And the reason I'm making sure that these parameter names are exactly the same as in the question paper is because sometimes if you don't use the corresponding names that's given to you in the paper, they will mark you down, regardless of whether or not your code works. Just the fact that you failed to adhere to the instructions given is reason enough for them to mark you down. If you ask me, it's a bit petty, but hey, I don't make the rules. So make sure that all your names are as given in the question paper. Okay, so now with department, go to NDT. Perfect. And that's what the question says if you were to read it. And then now we have getters for full name, for crew ID, and for department. Okay. And there is a shortcut to getting the getters and setters, but I won't be doing the shortcut because I don't want you guys to get lazy. So we'll just go over it as it is right now. If you want to get the shortcut, well then Google it. But in my case, I'll be doing it the old-fashioned way. It's good practice. Makes you type faster anyway. String get department. Return department. And then the last one, public int get crew ID. And this returns crew ID. Okay, just zoom out a bit. Perfect. And now for the last one, code a toString method. And here we have to read the question. It says add a toString method to the class that will return a string containing all the information in this format. So a full name, tab, the text crew ID, space, the value for the crew ID, tab, and then these open bracket, department inside, close bracket. Okay. And he gave us an example there just so you can see or have an idea of what it should look like. So we'll take that to note and get started on the toString. And remember, toString is a string method because it returns a string, right? It represents the object itself, this class. The toString just prints out the values of this class essentially. It's a string representation of the class itself. So we're returning its full name plus a tab, then crew ID plus a space, then the crew ID itself. And then after that, we are getting a tab, if I'm not mistaken. Let's just check. Crew ID tab, yes. Bracket, square bracket, plus department. And then close the bracket there. So full name, tab, crew ID, space, the value, tab, bracket, department, bracket, right? Full name, tab, crew ID, space, crew ID, tab. Perfect. And then here it just tells us that that last field there, the static variable, will be used in question 6. Okay. And look at that, 17 marks in the bag without having wasted time reading that entire section up there. And you'll see it's more or less the same for question 3. Okay, so now on question 3, and you'll notice that it's quite similar to question 2 in that we're given a class diagram and told to implement it. But there's a key difference. So let's read. Use a class diagram below to create a class called officer. This class will inherit from the crew member class and will be used to create objects that will store the details of an officer. The diagram below indicates required fields and methods. Okay, so very similar, but again, this keyword right here, inherit. When you see that, you should instantly think of the whole concept of inheritance in Java. And just to give a quick summary of what that is, inheritance is when we take the methods and variables from one class and allow them to be used in another class, right? A good example of this would be maybe like a parent class and a child class, like literally a parent and their child. And now obviously the parent has their own attributes, the child has their own attributes, but certain attributes of the parent are also available to the child, right? Like when, you know, how parents make children, they transmit their DNA. So the child has similar DNA to the parent. They have similar behaviors to the parent, maybe similar eye color, but there's other things that are different within the child, right? So the child also has their own extra fields. And I know that's a bit of abstract example. So once we get to the code, it'll look a bit more familiar and make a bit more sense. So let's do that. 3.1 says, write code to create a new class called officer that extends the crew member class. So let's jump to the code. So we come here and then we create our new class called officer in this case. Finish, close, zoom. Okay. So we see here that we have two fields that we need to make private and a public one. It's public static int. Okay. So it's private int rank, private local date, because this is a date promoted, and then public static int num promoted officers. And that's set to 0 to start with. Just import that. Okay. Now the constructor. In here, you'll see these very familiar fields, right? String NFN, NCID, and NDT. But you'll notice that we don't have it up here. But we do have it up here in question 2, right? We already dealt with this. And this is just the whole idea of inheritance, being able to access these fields in our subclass and being able to use them in this subclass. So let's just implement that. So our constructor is called officer. And I won't type all of that out. I already did that. So I'll just copy paste that. And then we have these two extra ones for rank and RK and NRK and local date NDP. Okay, but now there's something missing. We have our constructor, we have the variables up here, but currently we haven't told Java that this class is inheriting from crew member. We haven't done that. This is just currently its own normal class. And to make sure that Java knows that this class is inheriting from crew member, we have to add this keyword up here next to the class declaration. So we just say extends crew member. And now Java knows that officer extends crew member. Officer inherits from crew member. That's what we need to do. Okay. So now we have a constructor as well, and we'll see this error over here. What does this error say? The error says implicit superconstructor crew member is undefined. And that's an error we get when dealing with inheritance. So when you see that, don't be afraid. We'll see how to quickly fix that right now. So what that means is that we need to type this in to our code in fn, in cid, and ndt. And the error is gone. Now what this does is that it calls the constructor of the parent class. You see how it takes in the same exact arguments in the same exact order in fn, in cid, in dt. Same thing here, fn, cid, dt. So this is just calling the constructor of the parent class. Whenever you see the keyword super, it has to deal with the parent class. And in this case, we're calling the parent class's constructor inside our child class's constructor so that we can be able to use these fields instead of having to retype all of this because that's tedious, right? We don't want to do that. We're lazy. So now we've called the parent constructor and these three fields have been initialized. Now we have to do the RK and date promoted. So same thing as we usually would. Date promoted is equal to NDP. Just like that. With that, we're done. Okay. And now we have our getters for the rank, the title, and the string. So let's do the rank first. The rank is a number, so this would be a public int get rank. And that just returns rank. Now get title is a bit different because you don't have a field called title up here, right? So let's read it here. Code a method named getTitle that will return a string containing the title of the officer based on their rank using the table below. Okay, so this means that using the rank will return this specific string, right? If the rank of 1 will return unsigned, 2, lieutenant, so on and so forth. So this means that we need a bunch of if statements, or you could use a switch statement here, but I've found that most people are more comfortable with if statements, so we'll do ifs because at the end of the day, it does the same thing. There's no need to overcomplicate life if you feel more comfortable doing ifs. So that's what we'll do. So saying if rank is equal to 1, then we want to return unsigned, and then else if rank is equal to 2. Now this one's a bit of a tricky word to spell, so I'm just going to copy it. Okay, and then honestly, I don't know why I even typed out the first one when I could have just copied to begin with. So I'll just do that for the rest of them. Okay, so now that does what we wanted to do. When rank is 1, we return unsigned. All the way up till when rank is equal to 4, we return commander. And if none of these cases are met, it means that our rank is equal to 5. Hence, we return captain over there as our last case. Okay, back to the question. 3.7 says code a toString method. Using the getTitle method in question 3.6 and the one created in the crew member class. So they give us an example of what it'll look like. And you should notice that up until this section over here, we've already done this, but we've done this in the crew member class, right? The whole full name tab, crew ID. This exists. We already have this now as a toString method in our crew member class. But what we want to do now is create a toString for our officer. But why would we want to type out this again? Like, why would we want to do this whole thing again when it's already been done for us, right? And that's the nice thing about inheritance. Remember, we're lazy, so we don't want to keep on doing the same thing over and over. We don't want to repeat ourselves. If this has already been done for us, all we need to do is adapt it to fit our needs. And in this case, our needs are we want to use that section as well as adding the title at the end. So you'll see how to do that. It's quite simple. So now we have a public string because it's a toString. It returns a string. And we say return. Remember, when we're dealing with the parent class in our child class, we use the keyword super, and now we're calling the method toString because that's the method we want, right? We want to use this method, super.toString. And then after doing that, we also want to add our title at the end, right? So it said add a space first and then add get title, just like that. And this will give us the exact same output as what we're looking for here, where the titles add at the end. All right. And now last one, 3.8, code a method named promote that will increase the rank of the officer by 1 if they have a rank of 4 or below. Okay. So let's stop there and do that first part. So public void because it returns nothing. Promote. And then they're saying if the rank is less than or equal to 4, we should increase the rank, right? So we did that first part. The method should update their date promoted to the current date and increase the number of promoted officers by 1. So update date and increase promoted officers. So how do we do update date? We just say date promoted is equal to the current date. And to get the current date, we say local date dot now, just like that. And then we also have to increase the number of promoted officers. So num promoted officers plus plus, just like that. Save. Okay, so that's question 3 done. Another 25 marks without yet having read that entire statement up here, right? So now we did what? We did 17 marks in question 2 and 25 marks in question 3, leading to a total of what? 42 marks without even having read that stuff, right? Your peers would still be fumbling in question 2 because they were reading everything and you would be already done with 42 marks of the paper. That's a lot. That's significant. So see how you don't need to stress yourself when starting. And this was relatively easy. You could have done this. I know you could have. Okay, now for question 4. 4.1 says, write code to create a new class called crew member manager. So that's what we'll do. Come here, new class, crew member manager, finish, close, zoom. Okay. And it says, add 2 instance variables to this class, an array called CArray capable of storing 80 crew member or officer objects. Name this array CArray. Okay. So we have to, I'm assuming it's private. We'll see now. Crew member manager array called this CArray is equal to new crew member manager, and they said they should have 80 spaces, right? Perfect. And then an integer called size to keep track of the number of objects added to the array called CArray. These 2 variables must not be accessible outside the class. Okay, yeah, so both of them should be private. Should have read the whole question now. Bad habit there. Okay, so private int size equal to 0 to start. Now, some people get confused as to why we need a size variable when we already know that this has a length of 80. So if you can kind of think of it like this length of 80, right? If you can think of a classroom, let's say the classroom has 80 seats in it. But just because the classroom has 80 seats in it doesn't mean that all those seats are occupied. It doesn't mean that we have 80 students in that classroom. We could have 1 student, 2 students, 3, so on and so forth. So 80 tells us the number of seats, where size will tell us the number of actual students in the classroom. And this size is what's more important to us. We want to know how much of the space given is actually allocated, is actually being used, right? That's more important than knowing just in general how much space there is. And that's what this AT tells us. So that's why we also need a size to know how much we've occupied so far out of the AT. Okay. So now we have two of these fields. And the reason we, whoop, that's a mistake. It should be a crew member array, not crew member manager. And the reason why we're using crew member instead of officer here is because we wanted, as the question says, we wanted to be able to be capable of storing either crew member or officer objects, right? And the way to do that is we remember that crew member is the parent class and officer is the child class. So a crew member object can be stored in here, and so can an officer object, because crew member is kind of like the umbrella that encompasses everything else. If we use officer as our array type, then we'd only be able to store officer objects and not crew member objects. That's why we use crew member, because it's the umbrella, it's the parent class. Okay. So 4.2 down. Now 4.3. Create a constructor for the class that will read the contents of the text file, crew members.txt. Each line of the file contains information for a single crew member or officer object. Your method should do the following. Okay. So before even reading any of that, let's first break down how to read from a text file, right? Because that's the most important part. If you get the steps down, everything else kind of flows. So firstly, we need to make our constructor, because that's where all of this will be happening. Okay, now in here we need to read from a text file. And when we're reading from a text file, we have a few steps to follow. One is, firstly, we need to open the file in our code. And then secondly, we need to loop through the file line by line. And then we need to read each line and do something with each line. These 4 steps, if you can get these down, the code will flow much easier. So let's do that. How do we open a file in Java? Well, we need this class called scanner, right? The scanner object. I usually call mine sc file. You can call it whatever you want. And this is equal to new scanner, new file. And in our case, the file is called crew members.txt. So let me just import these. Okay. So we have our scanner and we have our file object. That's how we open our file. But now we're getting this error. What does this error say? It says unhandled exception, type file not found exception. So when dealing with files in Java, there's a chance that when trying to open this file, Java might not find it, right? And what we want to happen in that case is we don't want our code to crash. We don't want it to stop working. We just want to try to do this. And if an error is encountered, we should catch that error and do something with it, right? So I gave you the keywords there. We're going to try to do whatever we're doing here. And if there's an error, we're going to catch that error. In our case, it's the file not found exception. Call it E. And then in here, we're going to print out that error. Or just print out a statement saying the error has been handled, right? File not found in our case. Just import that as well. Okay. So we've successfully opened the file in our code. Now we want to loop through the file line by line. And in Java, there's 2 types of loops. There's the while loop and the for loop. We use the for loop when we know exactly how many times we want to loop, right? An example of this is if we want to loop 10 times, we'll just say this, right? That would be our header if we want to loop 10 times. In our case, we're looping through a file and we don't know how many lines that file has. So we can't give an explicit number saying we want to loop through 10 times because we don't know how many times we want to loop. We don't know how many lines are in that file. But we do know that we want to loop until we've reached the end of the file. And to do that, we'll then need to use a while loop, because while loops loop until a certain condition is met, right? Whereas for loops loop until we loop for a specific number of times. While loops don't. They loop until a specific condition is met. And in this case, our condition is while sc file dot has next line, right? While there's still a line to be read, while we haven't reached the end of the file, that's what that's saying. Keep looping. And once we've done that, we want to read each line, right? So now we have this string and we call it line. It just makes sense. And we say it's equal to sc file dot next line. And this gets the line that we're currently looping through, currently iterating through. That's this line. And now we want to do something with the line, right? So this is where we then have to come back to our question and see what's going on. So it says your method should do the following: read each line from the file and extract the data. Okay, so what does that data look like? And this is when you come back up all the way to question, not question two, the section above question two, where they explain what's going on, right? You see now how we have a use for reading here. Before we didn't have a purpose for coming here, but now we do. So this is what our file looks like. They gave us a few examples just to give us an idea of what to expect. So here we see we have 5 things. Here we have three things. Well, I meant to select that, 3 things. And we see that our delimiter, the thing that separates these data points, is a hashtag, right? We're using a hashtag to do that. And then if we come down here, they just give us an actual description of what each thing represents. So in the case that we have 3 things, we have full name, crew ID there, and department. In the case that we have 5, we have full name, crew ID, department. So you see the first 3 are always the same, but then the last 2 are different here. In this case, we have rank and date promoted. And this is very similar to what we've seen in our code, right? For officer, the only new things we have here are rank and date promoted. These last 2 here. Forget about the static one. These last 2. And then for crew member, we just have the first 3, right? So that's what our data looks like. And now with that knowledge, we want to, as the question says, we want to, where is it now? We want to extract the data. So let's extract the data. I'll just copy this up here and paste it so we have an idea of what to expect. So this will be like a quick example that we can refer to while we're coding. So currently, this is what our line might look like, right? If it had 5 things, if it had 2, if it had 3 rather, it would just look like that. But let's just leave it this way for now because the difference is not really that important. So we have the line, it looks like that currently. And now we want to extract each data point as its own separate thing. And the easiest way to do that is we create another array, call this one tokens. And this one is equal to the line. And we're splitting that line with our delimiter, and which is in this case is a hashtag. So now what this would look like is we have this. And instead of being that way, it'll look something like this, where it's an array of strings with separate data points like that. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so now we've split that and we have the data, but we're not done yet, right? We want to still add it to our array. We have to, as the question says here, back to question 4, it says we have to instantiate the appropriate type of object, either a crew member or an officer, using the data extracted from the line. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, there's 2 cases, right? There's a case when we have 5 objects, as like now we do 5 strings, and there's a case when we have 3, just the name and the ID and the department. So we know that it'll be an officer when it has 5 things, just like how our class has 5 parameters here, our constructor. And we know that it will be a crew member when our tokens array has 3 things, just like how our constructor has 3 parameters. So in that case, that's how we'll determine whether or not to create an officer or a crew member. So let's add those cases. Simple if statements. We're saying if tokens.length is equal to 5, then we're dealing with an officer, right? And then we could just add our else there when we're dealing with a crew member. So officer, crew member. Now, to make our lives easier, let's create the actual variables, which would be our full name up here. And this would be equal to the first one, right? It's always the first one, tokens at 0. And then we also have our crew ID, which is an integer. crew ID, and that's equal to tokens at 1, right? That one. But now we're getting an error. And what's this error saying? It says type mismatch cannot convert from string to int. And that's because although this is what it looks like in our array, right? It's a number, but this number is stored as a string. Everything that we read from a text file is given to us as a string, regardless of whether or not it's a number, a double, a boolean. It's always a string. So when we deal with it in our code, we have to convert it back into an integer, or the type that we want it to be. In our case, we want it to be an integer. And a simple way to do that, you just say integer dot value of, and in our case, we're saying value of tokens at 1. And there we go. And then we also want the department. So we get the department, and that's equal to tokens at 2. In this case, we want it to be a string, so we don't have to convert anything. So we've handled the first 3. And now in the case that it's an officer, we have these last 2 to handle, right? So we'll do that inside the if statement. So this one will be the rank. So int rank. And remember it's an integer, so we have to convert it first. And that'll be tokens at 3. And then lastly, we have to deal with the dates, right? And to do that, we create a new local date object, date promoted, and this is equal to local date. This is how we convert from a string to a date. Local date dot parse. We give it the value of the date, which is tokens at 4. But now there's a problem. This looks okay, but that's a deception. It's not actually okay. We need to give Java some knowledge of the format of the date. Currently, it just takes in the string and doesn't know how the date is formatted. And by that, I mean, you can see that our format here is, I'll just write it up here. It's the day, it's the month, and then it's the year, right? 4 times. There could be an instance where maybe we give it in the date like that, but that's not our case. We should deal with this case. So focusing on this case, as you can see, that's what it looks like. Java also needs to know to interpret that string as a date in this format. And to do that, we'll just add this section here. And I'm going to a new line so it fits on the same page. We need an object called datetime formatter. And we say dot of pattern. And in here, we give it the pattern that we want. In our case, as discussed up there, it's DD, MM, and then the year. Just like that. And now everything should work. Oops, everything should work. Okay, so we've successfully extracted all the different types of fields to expect here, right? And then all that's left is to create our officer object. Since we're dealing with an officer here, tokens is equal to 5, tokens dot length. So officer, I call mine A, you can call it whatever you want, is equal to new officer. And we just pass in the values there as we normally would with a constructor. Full name, crew ID, and department, as well as those last 2 there, our rank and our date promoted. I'll zoom out so it's a bit easier to see. Maybe a bit, not too much though. Hope that's okay. So that's our date promoted. And then so that's now been successfully handled. And now to handle the case when we're dealing with a crew member. Remember, crew member only has these 3 fields to worry about. We don't have anything else to stress about. So in our case, we'll just say crew member, call it A again, is equal to new crew member. And now we only need to worry about these first 3 fields here. So full name, crew ID, department, done, right? So this part has been successfully finished, instantiating the appropriate type of object. And now to deal with this second part here of adding the crew member or officer to object to the available position, all we have to do now is use our size. Because remember, size tells us how many things are in the array. So what we need to do here is say carray at size is equal to A. and C array size is equal to A. Same thing. We're just adding our new object to the array. But now there's a problem because size isn't changing. You see how when we start size is equal to 0 and it just remains 0. We're not increasing anything. So what we want to do is every time after adding, we need to increase size to tell our code that, oh, okay, we've added a new object. Now the next time we add, there should be an increase in the number of objects in the array. And the simple way to do that is after all of this, we just say size plus plus. That's our last thing to do. We're incrementing size accordingly. And we do it outside the if and else because the size should increase regardless of whether it's an officer or a crew member because we're adding either way. Okay. And that was the last point as well in our 4.3. So 11 marks, check. Now 4.4, code a toString method to combine the values of each object in the array. Okay. So let's come here. I will minimize this just so that our code doesn't get too overbearing. So let's go back here. Oops. See. Okay. So we need to make a toString here. Public string toString. And in this string here, what it should return is each and every single object that is inside C array should be printed out here, right? So we need to loop through the entire array and then print out each object as we pass through it, right? So we use this pattern here of having a result string started up there. And then in here, we'll loop through the entire array. So starting at 0. And now what do we use? Do we use 80 or do we use CRA.length? No, we use size because remember size tells us exactly how many things are inside that array. So we use size there. And now we want to print out each object. So we're saying result plus equal to, so keep adding to result plus equal to, and then we say CRA at I. And now remember, CRA at I is either an officer object or a crew member object. And remember, for either of them, we have our own toString methods in there as well, right? We have two strings. So all we need to do, if this is, think about it representing an actual object, we just have to say CRA at I dot toString, just like that. And if this notation here is confusing to you, this is equivalent to saying result is equal to result plus that. So I'll just write it out in full if it's confusing. And then we want to print a new line so that each time we pass through a different object, it's printed on a new line. It's formatted correctly. That's just to format. So, okay, we have a result. We've looped through the entire thing. Then at the end after the loop, we just want to return our result at the end. And that's our toString done. Okay. So scrolling down, we see question 5 now. And question 5 says, write code to create a class called crewMember UI that will allow for simple text-based user interface and output. I don't know why they put so many words here. All they mean is now we're creating a class that has a main method. So come up here, new class crewMember UI, finish, zoom, and now type out our main method. Perfect. And in this main method, we want to create a crew member object in an appropriate place in the class using an appropriate method. So that appropriate place that they're talking about is just inside the main method, and the appropriate method is just the constructor, right? So we're creating our new crew member manager, calling it A. That's equal to new crew member manager, a normal way of instantiating a class. And then that's done, 2 marks. And then it says display a list of all the information about the crew members or officers using the appropriate method in the crew member manager class. Okay. So to do that, that means we have to use our toString that we just created. So type out your shortcut there. Don't be lazy like me, type out the whole thing. And then say a dot toString. And now hopefully, if everything is done right, we should have an output showing. And there we go. And if we compare it, let's just look at the first one, Taylor, and the last one, Dwayne. Taylor, and last one is Dwayne. So perfect. Everything works now. And now I'll attach all the text files and yeah, I'll attach all the text files in the question paper in the description. So if you wanna, add it to your code as well, you can do that. And that's question 4 done. Now on to question 5. No, question 6 actually. That was quick. Yeah. Okay, now for question 6. So we're given a whole paragraph here. Let's read it. The results of the tests are stored in the text file named testresults.txt. Okay, so this test had 2 text files. The file contains the crew IDs and test scores of the crew members and officers on separate lines. The test center can only assess 10 crew members and/or officers, producing a text file with exactly 20 lines. Each test result is stored on 2 separate lines, the first for the crew ID and the second for the test score out of 100. Okay, so that means every 2 lines represents 1 officer, right? Or crew member. Every 2 lines represent 1 officer. The first line is their ID, the second line is their score, and this is another one, different ID, and that ID score, different ID, and that ID score, and we'll have 10 of these in our text file, as you'll see. Okay, so here we're still in crew member manager, and 6.1 says code a method called find crew member to search for a crew member or officer object in the array called CArray who has the matching crew ID. The method must accept an integer parameter for the crew ID and return the integer position of the object in the array. Okay, so we're searching now, and we're searching based on a given crew ID. So let's code that method. We're in here, and I'll minimize our toString. Already dealt with that. And now we have to make one called public int find crew member. And remember, that's an int because it's returning the index of the actual crew member in our array. And it says our parameter should be the crew ID, right? So given a particular crew ID, we have to find the corresponding crew member in the array, which means we're looping through the entirety of the array there. So again, starting at 0 and all the way up to size, I++. And we're saying if we come across the crew member, if CArray at I dot get crew ID, remember this is a method we have in our class here, get crew ID, we've created this. So if CArray at I dot get crew ID, that crew ID is equal to the one we're given as our parameter, then we want to return I, because that means that whatever position I is, whatever number I is the index of this corresponding array, of this corresponding crew member or officer that has the corresponding crew ID, right? That's what that means. And in the case that we've looped through this entire array without ever meeting this condition, without ever having found a crew member that has the matching crew ID, then we want to return -1 at the end after the loop. And the reason we return -1 is because of the fact that -1 can never be a valid index in an array, right? There's no -1 position. We start at 0 and go from there. So if our search method returns -1, it just tells us that we haven't found what we were looking for. We ran through the entire loop and have not found what we're looking for. That's our return -1. So that's our method there for finding. So that's done. 6.1, check. Then 6.2, code a method named process test results to read all the lines from the text file called testresults.txt. Using an appropriate loop, read the crew ID and test score from the text file. In this method, add 6.2.1, add code to determine the position of the crew member or officer in the array called CArray using the method you coded in 6.1. So let's just focus on that before even reading anything. we need to find our crew member. So two things, read from the text file and find our crew member. Okay, so I'll minimize that now. We already worked on that. Space there. So this method is called process test results, right? Public void process test results, just like that. And this method should read through our entire file. If we remember our steps to follow, I'll just copy paste them as well from here. Want to open the file, loop through the file line by line, read each line, and do something with each line, right? Open the file, loop through, read each line, do something with each line. So if we remember, when reading from a file, we have to do our scanner. That's how we open our file. SC file is equal, SC file is equal to new scanner, new file. And our file is now called test results.txt. That's our file name. And then remember, we have to deal with this error, unhandled exception, which means we have to have our try and catch. Try and catch like that. And then after having our try and catch, we then have to loop through the file line by line. In this case, we know that the file has exactly 20 lines as was given to us, but that doesn't really matter. We still need a while loop just to keep things consistent. You could do it the other way as well, but I like consistency, so we'll use a while loop. While SC file.has next line. So we need to get the crew ID right. Remember, the first line is the crew ID and the second line is your score. So that's what we'll do. First one, crew ID. So this is an integer. Int crew ID is equal to integer dot value of SC file dot next line. So that gives us the first line. To get the second line, we'll say int score is equal to integer dot value of SC file dot next line. So it's the same thing. This one gives us the first line, this one gives us the second line. And each time we start our loop again, each time we iterate through this, this will always give us every first line and every second line. So it'll go like this. Next line 1, next line 2, and then again, next line 1, next line 2, and then again, same thing. So this one will always be the crew ID, and this will always be the score. So we did that. And now 6.2.1. Here we're told we should determine the position of the crew member or officer in the array. And how do we determine the position of the crew member or officer? Well, we've just created that method, right? Find crew member. This is our search method. We give it the crew ID, which we now have, and it should return the position of that crew member or officer in the array. So here we want to get our position. Call it in pos is equal to find crew member. Give it the crew ID, which is created up there. And remember, this will return our index, right? So we're storing it in position. It's an integer. So we've done that. 6.2.1. Check. Now, 6.2.2. Using the above position, check if the related person is A, an officer, and has met their test requirements. Okay, so before we reading forward, let's do this. I have to check if they're an officer or a crew member. How do we check if they're an officer or crew member? Well, to do that, we need to use this method called instance of. So we're saying if the object in the array at position is an instance of officer, then we do something else, we do something else. So all this is saying is if this object here has the type or belongs to the class of officer, then do this. Otherwise, do that, right? So it's a bit strange, right? We wouldn't see syntax like this too often. But all that is saying is, what type is this? If it's type of officer, then we want to do something here. Otherwise, in the case that is a crew member, we'll just do that, right? So let's continue here. And big mistake. Firstly, my try and catch, right? I forgot to put the catch there. So file not found exception E sysout. And we can just say file not found again. Okay, cool. So that's been done. And now we know that we're checking for the officer here. So let's continue reading the question. As it says, using the above position, check if the rated person is an officer and has met their test requirements indicated in the column score according to their rank. Then their rank is increased by 1, right? So if the person's rank was 1 and they had a title of unsigned, but they achieved the score within that range, we have to promote them by increasing their rank to 2, right? And if they had a rank of 2 and their title was a lieutenant and their score wasn't with that range, we have to increase their rank and title in that case to LT. So we're just gonna flow in like that, right? Just like that. So let's do that. We're saying if, well, firstly, we have to create our officer object, right? Officer, call it A again, is equal to, and now we're casting officer at CRA position. So what is this doing? Let me write it like this firstly. So we just want to create an officer object so we can deal with it in our code, right? We don't want to keep on saying CRA at positions all the way throughout our code. This just makes our life easier. But we can't just say officer A is equal to CRA at position, because Java says, wait, relax. This could either be a crew member or an officer. There's no way of me to know whether it's a crew member or an officer, right? So to ensure that we're dealing with an officer, because we already know that we are, right? But we have to make it explicit. We have to tell Java explicitly that this is an officer. And what we do is we cast it. This is called casting. This strange syntax here of adding the class name there. We're saying convert this to an officer object so we can deal with it as A, right? Okay, now back to the question at hand. We're saying we want to use the rank and their score to determine whether or not to promote this person, right? So what I will do is I will create a Boolean up here. We can call this Boolean has met requirements, and set that to false to begin with, actually, yeah. And now you can set this to true, but you'll see as we move on to the code, it'll make a bit more sense why I did it to false. So now it's if a dot get rank is equal to 1, and so if their rank is equal to 1 and their score is in between those two things, right, then we want to do something differently. So if a dot get rank is equal to that, and this score, as you remember, that score represents A's score, and score is greater than or equal to 75, then they have met their requirements. Has met requirements is equal to true. And now we're doing that how many times? 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So I'll just copy that, else if that. Okay. So in this case, we're saying if their rank is equal to 2 and their score is greater than 80. And then in this case, rank is equal to 3 and their score is greater than 85. And if their rank is equal to 4 and their score is greater than 90, okay. So everything looks a bit jumbled up. I hope the format and idea here makes sense. If something doesn't make sense, just again, let me know in the comments and I'll help you out. So that's been done. And now the last case for when they are a captain. When they're a captain, we can't promote them. This guy has reached the pinnacle of what it is to be a crew member or an officer, so they can't do anything more. You can't go up. But yeah, so we do nothing in that case. So let's continue reading here. Use a method called promote that you coded in question 3.8 to update the officer object by increasing the rank of the officer, incrementing the non-promoted officers field, and setting the date promoted field to the current date. Okay, so we do all of that up here in the case that has met requirements is true, right? So we did this already. That's why we did it, to check if they have met their requirements. So if this guy has met their requirements, if that's equal to true, is equal to true, then we want to promote this person, right? So we want to say a dot promote for starters. That's the first thing that we have to do, right? It says use a method called promote to update the officer rank, and then increment non-promoted officers. Our promote method already does that, right? If we check here in our officer class, our promote method sets the date promoted and non-promoted officers. It already does all of that. So they were just being a bit redundant here because we already did all of that. Yeah. So we can scroll down now. And then in the case that we're dealing with a crew member, it says, if a crew member has met the test requirements, the crew member must be promoted to an officer with a rank of 1 and today's date. The crew member object in the array must be changed to an officer object with crew members' details, a rank of 1 and today's date. Again, they're just repeating themselves there. Increment the static class non-promoted crew field you created in question 2. Okay. So let's handle that in crew member manager again. So now we're dealing with a case. We already did this one. This is when we're dealing with a officer. This is when we're dealing with a crew member now. So it's saying if the crew member has met their requirements, and to meet their requirements simply means they have to have a score of 75 and above to be considered to be promoted to being an unsigned, right? So let's come here. So we're saying if firstly create the object crew member A is equal to crew member at CRA dot position. And I was saying if A, actually no, we're just saying if score is greater than or equal to 75, and then we want to promote A, right? We want to say officer B here is equal to new officer. And this officer has the details of this crew member, right? Because we're promoting them. So A dot get full name and crew ID, because this is the officer's constructor and their department. So this is what we have currently, right? But now we have to consider those last two fields again. And the question says for the rank, if they need to be promoted, give them a rank of 1 and their date promoted should be today's date, right? So these last two fields would be 1 and local date dot now, today's date. That's what happens if they have a score of above. But we're not done yet, because as the question says, the crew member object in the array must be changed to an officer object, right? Which means that we have to swap this position. Whatever crew member at CRA position was there, we now have to swap it, right? So we say CRA position is now equal to B, just like that. And the same thing should actually be done for us here. We have to say CRA at position is now equal to A, because we're changing them. Whatever was there has now become this new one. Whatever was there has now become this new one. So that's been done. And 6.2.3, the method, this is talking about our process test results. The method should return a string containing a list of the names of all the crew members or officers who took the test. Okay, so that means, firstly, before even reading on, it's not a void, but it's a string. And I'll remove this. Hopefully you written that down somewhere. So the method should return a string containing a list of the names of all the crew members or officers who took the test. Add the label crew member or officer depending on if the person is a crew member or an officer. So let's focus on the first part. Add the label crew member or officer depending on what type they are. So it's a similar process to what we did with our toString, where we had this result object at the top. We're now doing the same thing. So I'll call it here, up here, string result, empty string. And then we're saying, if you're dealing with an officer, in this case we are, right? This is our officer. We're going to say result is equal to result plus, and that would be crew member, or no, officer with a space. Actually, yeah, with a space. And then if it's a crew member, it's the same thing, but with crew member. Instead of officer there, we say crew member. Okay. And then if the person has passed, include the word has passed and is promoted to after their name. Okay, so I have to include their name. Let's actually look at an example of what this should look like. So here it says officer, and then their name, Taylor Wenzel, has passed. Okay, so we need to add the name first after their type. So let's do that quickly. Where are we? We are here, officer, right? We just added the names at the front there. I mean the types, either crew member or officer. But after that, we also need to add their name. So let's do that quickly. A dot get full name. Just like that. Add a space as well, just so it's easier for us. And I'll copy that and do the same thing here. A dot get full name. Okay. So back to the same point here. It says, if the person has passed, include the word has passed and is promoted to after their name, and then add their new title and new rank. Okay. An example again. Has passed and is promoted to lieutenant commander. So has passed. We need to add that first. And how do we know if they have passed? Well, we already, for the officer, we already have this Boolean here called has met requirements. And we check if that is true, which we do in this if statement. So if has met requirements, which is what we're doing in here, then obviously we want to now add to result, right? So we're going to say result plus equal to has what has passed, right? Has passed. Let me just check. Has passed and is promoted to. Okay. Has passed and is promoted to, just like that. And then we have to add their title and their rank, right? So A has passed and is promoted to. Then we add their new title, lieutenant commander, and then their new rank, rank 3. So has passed and is promoted to. Their new title, A dot get title, and their new rank, rank plus A dot get rank, just like that. I don't want to zoom out too much because it gets overwhelming. But there we go. So that's what it does. We start there at the top, and then we come in here and add this section underneath, right? So we've done that, and then it says if the person has failed, include the message has failed after their name. Okay. So the only way to know if they have failed is if they have not met their requirements. Else result plus equal to has failed, and that's what we add. Okay, just has failed. Perfect. And now quickly, let's do the same thing for our crew member. We need to firstly add the has passed and is promoted to, or the has failed, depending on what their marks are. And in our case, to know if they have passed, we check in this case if score is greater than or equal to 75. If that's the case, then we have to add this section here. And we can just do the same thing, but underneath here. And instead of using A, we'll just put B, because remember now they become an officer. So it's no longer A, but it's this officer here, which is B. So B dot get title, B dot get rank, just like that. And then if they've failed, which means in this case else, we just add result there, but they've failed, just like that. Okay. And lastly, if the person is a captain, display their name and the message has participated in the test. So how do we know if the person is a captain? Well, we can check their rank. If their rank is equal to 5, then they're clearly a captain, right? And a captain is always going to be an officer object, never a crew member. So we can check that in here. We can say else if a dot get rank is equal to 5. We don't care about their score. We just want to know if they've written the test, right? So if a dot get rank is equal to 5, then we just simply add to our result here. But instead of saying has passed or has failed, we just say has participated in test. Perfect. So that section has been done here, just like that. And now we have to test it. 6.3. In the crew member UI class, call the process test results method and display the list showing the names of all the crew members or officers who took the test and whether they have passed or failed. Okay. So we save, and I'm getting an error somewhere. Oh, okay. We're getting our error still from this method because we still haven't returned result, right? We've done everything we need in here, but at the end of the method, right at the end, so right here, we want to then return result once we're finished with everything, just like that. And now coming back to the crew member UI, I'll just comment this out so it doesn't disturb us. And then we create another one. And here we say a dot process test results. And now I'm expecting a formatting issue because we missed something. Just try and think of what that error might be, but we still expect it to print out some stuff. It's just going to look a bit jumbled up. So let's do that. And there we go. So we have our stuff, but it's just one very, very long string, right? So we missed something. And what we missed is, this is where you give me the answer, but it's a video, so I guess we can't really interact in that sense. We missed the new line. So every time that we add it to our result here, at a certain point, we need to skip to a new line, right? And the easiest way to do that is to come here. Every time we'll deal with a new object, we just say /n before we do that. Every time we deal with a new crew member, which is here, we just say /n. Control S. And then I'll just zoom out so you can properly see the method as well. Get it in. It's quite a long one, this one, eh? Okay, so that's our code there. You can pause the video and take a look over it. And then give you a few seconds. Okay, perfect. I'll minimize that now. And then hopefully that has made the necessary changes that we need for it to be formatted correctly. So let's print. And there we go. Officer Taylor Wensall has passed and is promoted to Lieutenant Commander. Officer Bongi LaRue has passed and is promoted to Commander rank 4. And the same thing with Officer last one, right? So let's check the first one. Officer Taylor and Tan Shua, rank 4, rank 3. Okay, so 6.3 is now complete. Check. But I noticed a few differences between their output and our output. For example, they don't have colons, whereas we do, right? We have those colons. And also the crew member is formatted differently. Ours is lowercase m and no spaces. Theirs has a space and is an uppercase. So things like this are important. I know they seem minor, but they can still mark you down for it. You can lose the 1 mark just because your output does not look the same. It's petty, but hey, we don't set the test, right? We write them. So let's adhere to the rules and make sure our output looks correct. So for starters, I'll close that. come back to the method process test result, and then just remove our colons. So I have a colon here at officer, we have a colon at crew member, and our crew member also has to change to look like that. Okay, and with that being done, if we print again, everything looks the same now. Perfect. Cool. And now lastly, 6.4. In the crew member UI class, display the number of crew members who were promoted and the number of officers who were promoted. Use the static class fields you created in question 2.2 and 3.3. Your output should appear as follows. Okay, so there's that and that. Now let's just do that then. I'll comment this out again because I don't want it to disturb us. So actually, I lie. We need this method. This method's important, so I won't comment it out. Because in this method, this is where the non-promoted officers and non-promoted crew are changed. Otherwise, they'll be 0. So the first one is we want to print out number of promoted crew members like that. Space there. And to access a static field, right, a static property, we don't have a way of doing that right now, right? We need to actually use the class name. So if we're looking at the non-promoted crew members, the static field doesn't belong to a specific instance of the class. It belongs to the whole class itself. So when calling it, we say crew member, like this, crew member, the name of the class, dot non-promoted crew. Now, I understand it's a bit of a strange syntax, but we just just know that when using a static field, you're using the class name and then calling it. Class name, calling it. So we have that. And then I'll copy this and do the same, but for officers. Number of promoted officers. Let's just actually check if that's what they say. Officers, yeah. And now remember, this one belongs to the officer class, right? Non-promoted officers. So instead, we'll say officer instead of crew member. Non-promoted officers. Save and run. We expect this to be equal to 2 and that to be equal to 4. Let's see what happens. Non-promoted crew members, 0. This one is 4. Okay. So there's a error with how we handle our crew members, right? Which means that in our process test results method, over here, when we are promoting the crew member to an officer, we actually didn't increment it anyway. If you look at it, we did the officer here, the position, yeah, but we never actually incremented this field here, non-promoted crew. So just to quickly fix that error, we now have to say crew member dot non-promoted crew plus plus, and that will fix our issue hopefully. So let's do this again, run, and there we go. That's equal to 2 and that's equal to 4. Perfect. Okay, and with that, we are now done with our IEB 2022 IT past paper. There's a few tricky sections, so if something is still unclear, let me know in the comments. And if you really feel like you need extra help with IT, check out the link in the description. There you'll see my website where I offer IT tutoring services. We mainly focus on Java, and there we go through a bunch of past papers, fundamentals such as searching, sorting, and also how to break down a problem, to make you a more efficient, well-rounded programmer. And I promise with me, Java will be a walk in the park, the easiest part of your paper. I can guarantee that. You'll see also in the description, I added the links to the files, the test result file and the crew members file. I also added links to the past papers. You can download that as well. I'll also be going over more past papers. So if there's anyone you want me to cover in particular, let me know in the comments. But if not, I'll just go through the sequential order. So next we'll be doing 2021. And yeah, with that being said, thank you for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day.